Today we're in week number 3 of our prodigal series, and this is when we get to talk about the character that oftentimes gets overlooked in the prodigal son story, but it's actually the character that the story is kind of being directed to in the first place. Remember, what we're talking about is the fact that if you are far from God, no matter how far, there is still hope for you, whether you're a rule breaker on one side here of the spectrum, or whether you're a rule keeper on the other side of the spectrum. And it's the rule keeper, actually, that oftentimes, ironically, is further away from God than the rule breaker is. Let's remember the context for the prodigal son story in the first place. You can find it in Luke 15, verses 1 and 2. It says, tax collectors and other notorious sinners, that is, rule breakers, often came and listened to Jesus teach, and this made the Pharisees and teachers of the religious law, otherwise known as the rule keepers, it made them complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. And it's with this backdrop that Jesus tells 3 parables. First, the parable of the sheep, and then the parable of the lost coin, and then finally the big parable, the one we're looking at, the parable of the prodigal son. So today what I want to do is draw out from the story 5 marks of a rule keeper who is far from God. Now, just because you're a rule keeper doesn't mean that you're far from God. But if you can check off 3 or 4 of these things in this list, if this sounds like you as we read this story together, then maybe this story can serve to mend your relationship with God. Let's start with the text in verse 25. It says, meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working, and when he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. The servant said, your brother is back, and your father has killed the fattened calf, and we're all celebrating because of his safe return. So here's the first mark of a rule keeper far from God. You work for yourself, not for the benefit of others. Look at what it says there, that the older son was out in the fields working. He was the only one. He was the only guy who didn't get the memo. Bible background commentary helps us with this. It says that the elder brother is apparently the only person in the village uninformed about the party, bursts the bounds of plausibility in the real world, where the elder brother should himself have taken the lead at reconciling father and younger son. Now, this touch of unrealism is necessary to graphically underline the older brother's isolation from the community. The older son is out there working hard in the field, but it's all for himself. His work is self-directed. It's to give himself a pat on the back. It's not for the good of the community. In fact, it creates more isolation in the end. And he clearly doesn't even care about his brother. Here's the second thing. You get mad at God for his extravagance toward others. Verse 28 says the older brother was so angry that he wouldn't go in. And the irony is that you're blind to God's extravagance toward you. Jesus goes on to say that the father came out and begged the older son to come in and party. And that was awfully generous of the father, as we learn from the Bible background commentary again. See, publicly refusing to enter in the midst of a party makes an intra-family dispute public news, and it dampens the celebration. And worse yet, it shames the father, just as the younger brother had shamed before the father when he took the inheritance and left. And in a culture where honor and shame were essential values, this was a big deal. And this is also a grievous insult to the father's dignity and could have warranted discipline or being disinherited. But instead of punishing him, the father comes out and humbles himself, giving up his honor to seek reconciliation with his son. Does that sound familiar? Turns out that the father's attitude toward the older son, the rule keeper, was not unlike his attitude toward the younger son, the rule breaker. God, the prodigal father in the story, is extravagant. He's recklessly generous with both of them. He overlooks offense and he tries to build a relationship in both cases. But the rule keeper in the story is actually looking at relationships transactionally. He responds to his father, all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to do. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. This is like adding insult to injury for the father. See, failing to greet one's father with a title like father or sir, which the other son had done earlier in the story, was a grievous insult to the father's dignity. And this son emphasizes his service even though the father wanted a son rather than a servant. Don't miss this point here. Remember, the younger son, the prodigal son who had so offended his father, runs away, but he comes back willing to be a servant. And the father says, no, I don't want a servant, I want a son. And isn't it interesting that the older son now is out in the field working, and he comes back, and the whole time he's just thinking about slaving away for his father. He's thinking about his relationship with his father in terms of what he can do for his father and what his father can do for him. That's thinking about a relationship transactionally, which is not at all what God is interested in. And finally, the last sign that you might be a rule keeper who is far from God is you stay on the outside. See, here's how the story ends. Jesus taught, his father said to him, look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he's found. And that's it. That's the end of the story. You notice it doesn't say, and so the older brother said, Dad, you're right. Let's go in and party. No, the older brother apparently, at the end of the parable, stays on the outside. And remember, Jesus is telling this parable for the rule keepers who think that God is more interested in their energy and their efforts and their works than he is in an actual loving relationship. And so I challenge you, if you are a rule keeper, to take a look at these 5 marks and see if maybe 3 or 4 of these things don't apply to your own life. And the good news is you don't have to stay on the outside. You can repent just like the younger son did and come back to God, and he'll feast with you.